My grateful thanks to Kalpana. Thank you for your work and your solidarity. And Amrit Wilson for your inspirational work through time and for teaching many of us things that we needed to know. To the Gender Institute for hosting the event, and to Nishreen for being my friend, and to Meena. Thank you all. India, December 2012. The gruesome gang rape of a 23-year-old woman in Delhi led to the victim's death. The gang rape of an 18-year-old Dalit woman in Punjab, followed by police refusal to act on her complaint, led to the victim committing suicide. These two events brought to the forefront the extreme nature of gendered and sexualized violence against women in India today. How intensely women live with the insecurity was rendered palpable following the overwhelming response of women across the nation. The devaluation of female life and the glorification of violence against women is structurally condoned and socially permissible, and has led to tragic forms of gendered and sexualized violence in the public, family, and political sphere, to dowry deaths, to acid throwing, to torture through gang and collective rape, to mutilation, and to honor killings. A woman in India is raped every 20 minutes. 95,000 rape cases are pending within the court system. 3 of 4 perpetrators of crime go free. Gendered violence and conflict is hardly the preserve of India. Regionally and globally, ethnic violence, wars, state-sanctioned terror have affected women in highly specific ways. The role of gendered and sexualized violence in South Asia reveals with horrifying specificity the ways in which women are discursively framed and socially targeted. How do everyday forms of violence against women facilitate large-scale events of gendered violence? The Hindu right's recurrent use of forms of violence against women across India, for example, have targeted women in riots, pogroms, and armed conflict. Muslim, Sikh, Christian, Dalit, Moonvasi, Adivasi women have been its targets. Sexualized violence has been deployed on the women of the other as vindication and marked subaltern women's bodies in wars of direct and indirect conquest. A gendered analysis of violence shows most of all that what women share is the way in which they experience this violence. The War Within, Calcutta, 1946, Kota, 1953, Rourkela, 1964, Ahmedabad, 1969, Bhiwandi, 1970, Aligarh, 1978, Jamshedpur, 1979, Moradabad, 1980, Meerut, 1982, Hyderabad, 1983, Assam, 1983, Punjab and Delhi, 1984, Bhagalpur, 1989, Bhadrak, 1991, Ayodhya, 1992, Bombay, 1992, Gujarat, 2002, Marad, 2003, Mao, 2005, Orissa, 2007, Jammu, 2008, Orissa, 2008, Muzaffarpur, 2013. Orissa. Violence. In 2002, I visited Gujarat. The words of Rasik, a Dalit boy, age 8, in a decimated colony in Ahmedabad, reverberates even today. "I'm not afraid of death," he said to me. "I'm frightened by life. Look what happens in life." As Muslim and Dalit women stared at each other in silence across a boundary wall that separated their homes and that separated Muslim from Dalit. In June 2002, Hindutva activists named Orissa the second to Gujarat Hindu Rajya in the nation. Hasina Begum, a Muslim woman in Orissa, tells me, "Every day little things happen. The clothes I put on the clothesline we share are thrown on the ground. The women tell me that we are achut, untouchable. Men and women react differently to us. My 4-year-old daughter goes to play with the neighbors and they push her head out the door to their house and whisper about me every time I see them. A Muslim woman from Kodra district tells me, "We came from Chotanagpur, a displaced from a mining town. Our village is surrounded by the RSS. We live like moles. I teach my children to be unseen. If we are quiet, perhaps people will leave us alone. The men, it is not easy for them. Last month there was violence in our village. Bajrang Dal members called us names. They threatened we would never work again, that we would have to leave. They said they were watching us. My husband came back shaken. He brought fear with him into the house. He forced me to have intercourse. It was not about intimacy. It was about power, about feeling helpless and wanting control. So here it is in our kitchen as we wait for it to strike. It already has." 36 million people lived in Orissa in 2001, 42 million in 2011. Christians were only 2.4% of the population, most of Dalit descent or Adivasi descent having converted to escape caste oppression. In Orissa, the Sangh Parivar's family of Hindu rights organizations has established an array of institutions since the mid-1990s, including trade and student unions, militant and women's groups, through a massive base of a few million. Coalesced by ideology and infrastructure, this formidable mobilization is the largest volunteer establishment in the state. These groups are close in ideological accompaniment and corroborate in practical matters to provide extra constitutional authority to Hindu majoritarian dominance. Each use aggression as an instrument in seeding outcomes toward minoritization. As of 2009, for example, the RSS had 6,000 shakas or centers with 175,000 cadre. The VHP had 150,000 primary workers. The Bajrang Dal had 60,000, with leaders across 200 akharas in the state. Complex factors of class and other disenfranchisements compel this cadre into coalescing. Sectarian education campaigns undertaken by the RSS-affiliated organizations teach dogma curricula to caste Hindus and Adivasis and Dalits in mobilizing against minorities. In addition, students and their families, for example, are expected to volunteer in local fundraising, in developmental work, in disaster relief. This majoritarianism is a prescriptive formula that functions through combining heightened capital, hyper-militarism, and primordial nationalism to consolidate imagined communities into the soul of the right nation. Its tactics include social and economic ostracization, forcible religious conversions, theft, torture, threat, sexualized and gendered violence, and eventually murder. Two laws I wanted to name in relation to Orissa that act against minorities are the Orissa Prevention of Cow Slaughter Act of 1960 and the Orissa Freedom of Religion Act. In 2007, mass targeting of Muslims, as in Patrakin, that of 1991, and the failure of justice in the aftermath consolidated the assault on Christians in Kandhamal in 2007 and 2008. I'm reading from fragments and going back and forth. This is not a linear narrative. In Jagat Singhpur, in Orissa, Jesus is the son of a subaltern god. Provoked by the Sangh Parivar, on 10 February 2004, 7 Christian women and a male pastor were tonsured, their heads shaved in a ritualized act by upper caste and Hindu-identified Dalit neighbors against their will, signifying their return to Hinduism. Staged in Bauri Sahi, a Dalit hamlet in Kilipal village adjacent to Kanimul, this event took place in Jagat Singhpur district of Orissa. As I narrate this episode from recent history, even today, a long-standing social and economic boycott remains in place against these women, the pastor, and their families. And a quote, the women, this is a composite narrative, the women tell me, the crowd formed to surround us. People we have known all our lives moved toward us, shouted and threatened. They held us down, the women held us down. As we tried to get away, our clothes were torn. They beat our bodies and dragged us. Some of them were family. We had called each other pony, sister, before. They wanted their hate to stay on our bodies so we could not forget. They said we were their own, their kin, their inside. That we were Hindus who had brought misfortune by becoming Christian. We, sister, she turns to me, were never, any day, their own. Post-2008, a colleague and I were supposed to go to collect, to understand what had happened. For 7 days we tried to go and we couldn't, and we kept getting these missives that if we went, our bodies would be charged so much that no one would even find evidence that it was actually us, so we didn't go. But something amazing happened. Some of these men and women got on a truck and came to us to testify. Post-2008. On September 30th, I had received a note from Ajay Kumar Singh, a human rights activist of Christian heritage, entitled, As I Saw That Day in Kandahar. He mourned what is, and a quote from him. It has been a painful day for us all, not only because of the type of incidences of killing women are new, not because the children are attacked, or old and infirm are axed, not because more than 100 houses were burned in a single attempt, not because sleepy villages were attacked when least expected at 4 a.m., not because the trees were felled from all directions during the daytime, not because villagers begged for security before police officials, not because police party could not stop the attackers numbering out around 6,000 that came from nowhere, as I heard, not because in every attack to a great extent people know the attackers and tell that to the police administration, yet the police and administration are not convinced of the identity of the attackers, nor because forces deployed in villages which are prone to, not deployed, I apologize, in villages that are prone to attack. It has been a painful day for us all, because this is the place where the Christian and Hindu, tribal and Dalit lived together once in harmony. It is in this area now that relatives are at each other, brother against brother, son against mother, daughter is against father. Until a couple of days back, one of my associates, a tribal, used to call his immediate cousin, his own father's brother's son, an ideal leader. Now, they have burned each other's houses down. What is more in store for them? For what and for how long? And now, the administration calls for peace meetings. Another composite of interviews that I conducted. In the first days, from the women that had come in the truck to meet us, and they hid in the basement of the Orissa Archbishop's house where we were able to sit and talk to them. In the first days of the violence, about 60 people surrounded the body, about 80 people surrounded the body, 500 people surrounded the body. His body was aflame. Hindutva workers asked that I become Hindu. They took a long time to die. Some Hindus aided our escape. He was marked from before. My son was marked from before. My son tells me that it is not over. Can I go back home? They say they must kill us, so we cannot tell what they have done. They killed Christians, buried them, then placed stones over the bodies to stop resurrection. At night, I can still hear, become Hindu, become Hindu, become Hindu. They beat him with a crowbar, another hacked him. People were afraid to give us shelter, but still did. They asked him to become Hindu. They hit me. My husband was axed, torched. I saw him buried. They desecrated his body. After this, what life is possible? I have seen his killers. The police ask, why am I agitated? He was decapitated. They torched her. They are our neighbors. Blood everywhere. The police do not arrest the people. Bits of bone. They threaten rape. It is hard to get the medical report. We cannot live at home. They killed his mother. We have lost our identity, our ration cards, identification papers, our bodies, ourselves. Who are we now? This is as I heard the women in the room talk one upon the other. So I couldn't really distinguish between the different stories, and this is the composite that emerged. And then over days we slowed down and we stopped and we went one by one and we collected the testimonials. Another woman, a survivor of rape, speech, a daunting testimony to things that break, to fortitude. She sat for hours next to me, and we talked, and then we didn't. I kept working through it. At some point, she would just touch my hand. At some point, she would be quiet. And then she started to speak. She said, I want to sit with you and cry. I wanted to die. I promised I would live, but I wanted to die. I thought I would go mad. Life brings a lot. This was my test. I wanted to remain myself. I wanted to make a life, a new life. I still feel so many nights the scenes repeat and repeat in my dreams. The deployment of violence on women, sexualized violence, hinges on the abuse of gendered power and the denigration of women as sexual beings. Gendered and social violence against women calls into focus the relation between social violence and gendered violence, and endangers the scope of women's rights in conflict areas even further than the already endangered and vulnerable conditions of women's rights elsewhere across India, at home, in society, in the workplace, in prisons, in schools. Sexualized violence against women in Gujarat and Christian women in Orissa turned them as embodied signs into literal and figurative battlefields. Rape is often a mechanism of this violence, as is parading the women of the other naked. We note the use of rape in Kashmir in cases in Gujarat during the partition riots, where there took place sexual mutilation of women, the severing of breasts, the tearing open of vaginas and wombs, and distinctively, tragically in Gujarat, the forced abortion, as Nasreen talked to some of this, abortion of fetuses and their displays on Trishuls, as Kalpana you also mentioned. Embodied violence is perpetrated during war and conflict situations, chronic or otherwise, where women's displacement, literal and psychological, and the trauma of losing one's home, male family head, and security are augmented by the added responsibility of child rearing and caring for the aged and infirm, often without any support. I'll end with two things. Violence as a category of analysis presences the way in which violence drives decision and response and constitutes lives, community, place, politics, and gender. As some of us had written earlier, the study of gendered violence should operate not as a shorthand for the understanding of violence on and against women, but also as an analytical category that is equally attentive to the ways in which normative ideas of masculinity and heterosexuality are disseminated amid a pervasive context of militant nationalism. I'll end with one thing, marginalia, rage, fear, and discontinuity space, the violence of apathy, desperation in children's eyes, the hardened laughter of survival. The night is a prolonged journey of contemplation as we reimagine the stories of our becoming. I recall Lutfera Khatun after Gujarat in Park Street, Kolkata, surrounded by Hindu extremists taunting, "Go back to Bangladesh." Luthuma, almost 80 years old, family friend, my mother's midwife. She helped grow me, a Muslim woman whose family emigrated to Kolkata in 1923. I'm reminded of these worlds, and to what I have learned from my father, my grandmothers, mothers, aunts, an extended circle of women that grew me, that the work of justice is incomplete